The city tasted like copper and rain. Chicago's downtown district never truly slept, but tonight the streets carried an unusual quiet, the kind that settled over concrete and glass when autumn storms rolled in from the lake. Water sheeted across Michigan Avenue in translucent curtains, washing the reflections of traffic lights into abstract watercolors on black asphalt. The digital clock outside the Prudential building blinked 11:47 p.m., its red numerals bleeding into the wet air. St. Haven Hospital rose 15 stories above the medical district, its windows forming a grid of yellow rectangles against the dark sky. Emergency vehicles came and went through the bay entrance like clockwork, their sirens a familiar symphony to anyone who worked the night shift. Most of the hospital's foot traffic had thinned to a trickle by midnight. Visitors went home. Day staff clocked out. The building transformed into a different organism after dark, quieter but more intense, a place where life and death negotiated in hushed tones while the rest of the world dreamed. Ethan Ward stood near the loading dock behind the ER entrance, watching rain bounce off the metal overhang. His security uniform hung loose on his frame, the navy fabric worn soft at the elbows and collar from too many washings. The radio clipped to his belt crackled intermittently with dispatcher chatter, routine check-ins from other guards scattered throughout the building. He'd learned to filter the noise, responding only when his sector code came through. 38 years old, 6 feet tall, dark hair starting to show threads of gray at the temples. A face that people forgot 5 minutes after seeing it, not because it lacked character, but because it belonged to the background of their daily experience. Service workers possessed that quality, a kind of social invisibility that allowed them to move through spaces without disturbing the narrative others constructed about their own importance. The cigarette between his fingers had gone out 10 minutes ago, dampened by humidity. He didn't smoke anymore, hadn't lit one in 3 years, but keeping the unlit stick between his fingers helped during the long stretches between rounds. Old habits from another life when smoking had been a way to mark time between missions, between casualties, between moments of violence that your mind refused to file away properly. His watch read 11:52. Grace would be finishing her math homework by now, working through the multiplication tables she'd been struggling with all week. Eights were giving her trouble. He'd promised to quiz her during his next break, maybe around 1 in the morning when things got really quiet. The radio burst to life with a different tone, sharper and faster. Incoming trauma. Bridge accident. Multiple vehicles. ETA 3 minutes. All available personnel to ER Bay. Ethan's body responded before his mind fully processed the words. He dropped the unlit cigarette and moved toward the emergency entrance, his boots finding purchase on the wet concrete as he broke into a jog. The automatic doors sensed his approach and swept open, releasing a blast of antiseptic-scented air that mixed with the rain. Inside the ER had already shifted into high gear. Nurses hurried between stations, pulling crash carts into position and prepping trauma bays. Dr. Reyes should have been on duty, but Ethan saw only Dr. Chen coordinating with the charge nurse, her face tight with concentration. Ethan positioned himself near the entrance, out of the way, but close enough to respond if security was needed. Traffic accidents sometimes brought in people who were drunk or high combative in their confusion and pain. His job was to keep the medical staff safe while they worked. The first thing he heard was the siren growing louder as it approached through the rain-soaked streets. Then came the lights, red and blue, strobing through the downpour, painting the ambulance bay in alternating colors. The vehicle skidded slightly as it took the turn into the bay, tires hydroplaning for a half second before gripping pavement. 2 paramedics jumped out, moving with practiced urgency. The gurney emerged from the back of the ambulance, its wheels rattling as they hit the ramp. The woman strapped to it looked like she'd been arranged by an artist who specialized in tragedy. Her clothes, expensive even in their ruined state, clung to her body in dark patches. Blood had soaked through the white silk of her blouse, spreading across her abdomen and chest in irregular patterns. More blood matted her hair against her forehead, mixing with rain and sweat. Ethan recognized wealth when he saw it. The cut of her clothes, the quality of the leather briefcase that had been tossed beside her on the gurney, the diamond studs still glinting in her ears. This was someone who lived in the penthouses that lined Lakeshore Drive, someone who made decisions that affected thousands of people she would never meet. The lead paramedic, a woman named Rodriguez, who Ethan knew from previous shifts, rattled off vitals as they wheeled the gurney toward the entrance. Female, early 30s, multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding, BP dropping, pulse thready at 92, GCS of 13 fluctuating. Vehicle collision, driver side impact against bridge guardrail. Prolonged extrication. Dr. Chen appeared beside the gurney, her gloved hands already reaching to assess the patient. The charge nurse called out for O-negative blood and started barking orders about getting a trauma bay ready. The organized chaos of emergency medicine unfolded exactly as it always did, a choreographed response to catastrophe that had been practiced thousands of times. Then Dr. Chen's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, and her expression changed, frustration flickering across her features. "Where's Reyes?" She directed the question at the charge nurse while stepping away from the gurney to take the call. Stuck on the expressway, the nurse's face had gone pale. Pile up near the interchange. He's texting that it might be 20-30 minutes, 20 minutes. Ethan watched the woman on the gurney, saw the way her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid movements. Saw the blood that continued seeping through the temporary bandages the paramedics had applied. Saw her skin taking on a waxy pallor that he'd seen before in other contexts, in other places where medical help wasn't measured in minutes, but in hours or days. Dr. Chen finished her call and returned to the gurney, but her movements carried hesitation. She was good, everyone knew that, but trauma surgery wasn't her specialty. She handled the routine emergencies, the broken bones and cardiac episodes, and diabetic crashes. High-velocity trauma with internal bleeding needed someone like Reyes, someone who could open a chest or abdomen and navigate the geography of damaged organs with absolute confidence. The woman on the gurney made a sound something between a moan and a gasp. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with shock. Blood bubbled at the corner of her mouth, pink and frothy. Ethan's instincts kicked into high alert. That meant lung involvement, possibly a pneumothorax or worse. He found himself moving forward without conscious decision. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget, the muscle memory of responding to trauma, of stepping into chaos when everyone else stepped back. He reached the gurney just as the woman's hands shot out, fingers wrapping around the charge nurse's wrist with surprising strength. "Wait." The word came out as barely more than a whisper forced through lips that had started to turn blue at the edges. "Please." The nurse tried to soothe her with practiced gentleness, but the woman's grip tightened. Her eyes searched desperately, looking for something or someone, seeking an anchor in a reality that was fracturing around her. "Just make it fast." Her voice cracked on the words. "I don't want the pain." The phrase hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd heard it before, spoken in different languages, but carrying the same meaning. Soldiers who knew they were dying, who'd seen enough combat to understand what their bodies were telling them, who just wanted the end to come quickly rather than slowly. It was the sound of someone surrendering to the inevitable. But this wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't some remote outpost where the nearest hospital was a helicopter right away through hostile territory. This was Chicago, in one of the best trauma centers in the Midwest, and there was no reason this woman had to die. Ethan pulled off his security jacket in one smooth motion, the fabric heavy with rain and sweat. He draped it across the woman's shoulders, tucking it around her body. The gesture was instinctive, born from countless similar moments when warmth had been the difference between a casualty, going into shock, or staying conscious long enough for real help to arrive. "You're not going anywhere." His voice came out steady and calm, the tone he'd used when talking to wounded 19-year-olds who'd stepped on IEDs and lost their legs. "Not tonight." Her eyes found his face and locked on. The fear didn't disappear, but something else entered her expression. Recognition of authority maybe, or just desperate hope that someone knew what they were doing. Dr. Chen stood frozen beside the gurney, clearly trying to decide what to do. The paramedics had stepped back, having transferred care to the hospital staff. The charge nurse looked between Ethan and the doctor, confusion evident in the way her hands hovered uselessly above the patient. Ethan placed 2 fingers against the woman's carotid artery. The pulse beneath his fingertips felt wrong, too fast and too weak, like a bird's heart beating against the cage of her ribs. He pulled back her eyelids, quickly checking pupil response. Reactive but sluggish. The blood at her mouth had increased, more bubbles forming with each exhale. Dr. Chen finally found her voice. "Mr. Ward, I need you to step back, please." But she didn't move to take his place. She stood there, paralyzed by the gap between what she knew she should do and what she felt capable of handling. Ethan had seen that look before on young medics during their first real casualties, the moment when textbook knowledge collided with human fragility and found itself desperately inadequate. He ignored the doctor and leaned down so his face was level with the woman's. Can you hear me? I need you to focus on my voice. She managed a tiny nod, her pupils dilating and contracting as she struggled to stay conscious. What's your name, Olivia? The word came out wet, more blood mixing with saliva. Olivia Hart. Olivia, I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay with me. Can you do that? Another nod, weaker this time. Her fingers, which had been gripping the edge of the gurney, began to relax. Ethan recognized the sign. She was sliding away, her body starting the process of shutting down to conserve what little energy remained. He pressed his palm against the wound on her left side, applying firm, even pressure. She gasped, her body arching slightly against the restraints. Pain was good. Pain meant she was still fighting. Breathe in through your nose. Count to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now out through your mouth. Slow. That's it. Do it again. She obeyed, her chest rising and falling in response to his commands. The breathing technique served two purposes. It kept her focused on something other than panic, and it helped prevent her from hyperventilating, which would only worsen the potential pneumothorax. Dr. Chen finally moved, stepping up to the opposite side of the gurney. Her hands began their own assessment, checking the bandages the paramedics had applied, feeling for other injuries. But her movements lacked certainty. We need to get her to surgery. The doctor's voice carried an edge of desperation. But Reyes is still. How far out? Ethan kept his eyes on Olivia while he spoke, maintaining that connection that was keeping her anchored. 15 minutes minimum, maybe 20. Ethan's jaw tightened. 20 minutes was a lifetime when someone was bleeding internally. He'd seen soldiers bleed out in less time, their lives pumping away into sand or mud or the metal floors of transport vehicles. I can stabilize her. The words came out before he could second-guess them. Dr. Chen's head snapped up. Your security. I was a combat medic. 3 deployments. 16 years. I know what I'm doing. The doctor stared at him, clearly trying to reconcile the man in the worn security uniform with someone who possessed the skills to handle trauma medicine. Around them, the ER continued its organized chaos. Other patients needed attention. Nurses hurried between bays. The PA system called for a respiratory therapist. Ethan didn't wait for permission. He'd learned long ago that in emergency situations, hesitation killed more people than action. He began calling out orders, his voice taking on the command tone that had once directed entire medical teams under fire. I need a stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, oxygen at 12 liters per minute, 2 large bore IVs, 18 gauge, ringers lactate wide open. Someone call the blood bank and tell them we need 4 units of O negative standing by. The charge nurse, bless her, responded to the authority in his voice without question. She moved immediately, gathering supplies and coordinating with the other nurses. Dr. Chen remained frozen for another few seconds, then made a decision. Do it, but I'm right here watching. Anything goes wrong, I'm taking over. Ethan nodded once, accepting the terms. He turned his full attention back to Olivia, whose eyes had started to drift closed again. Olivia, stay with me. Look at my face, that's it. You're doing great. Keep breathing just like I showed you. The nurse returned with the stethoscope. Ethan hooked it into his ears and listened to Olivia's chest, moving the diaphragm across different points. The sounds told a story he didn't like. Decreased breath sounds on the left side accompanied by a subtle crackling. Definitely a pneumothorax, possibly with hemothorax. The lung was compromised, filling with blood or air or both. He moved lower, listening to her abdomen. The sounds there were equally concerning. The normal bowel sounds absent, replaced by a tense silence that suggested internal bleeding. Her abdomen felt rigid under his gentle palpation muscles, guarding against pain. The blood pressure cuff went on next. The numbers weren't good. 90/60 and dropping. Her body was trying to compensate for blood loss by constricting peripheral blood vessels, but it was fighting a losing battle. Get me a needle decompression kit. Ethan kept his voice level, not wanting to telegraph alarm to Olivia, who was watching his face with desperate intensity. Dr. Chen hesitated. You think it's a tension pneumo? Ethan met her eyes. Left side. And it's getting worse. We decompress now, or she crashes in the next 5 minutes. The doctor studied Olivia's chest, watching the asymmetric rise and fall. Then she nodded at the nurse, who rushed away and returned with a sealed kit containing a large bore needle. Ethan opened the kit with practiced efficiency. The 14-gauge needle gleamed under the fluorescent lights, designed to punch through muscle and into the pleural space where air or blood had accumulated, collapsing the lung and building pressure that would eventually stop the heart. Olivia's eyes widened when she saw the needle. "This is going to hurt," Ethan told her honestly, "but it'll help you breathe. I need you to trust me." Her lips trembled, but she managed to whisper, "Okay." He located the landmark, the second intercostal space along the mid-clavicular line. His fingers found the slight depression between ribs, the exact spot where the needle needed to enter. He'd done this procedure dozens of times in combat, usually while under fire or in the cramped confines of a Humvee racing across desert terrain. Here in a well-lit ER with clean supplies and experienced staff nearby, it should have felt easier. Somehow it didn't. The needle went in smoothly, piercing skin and muscle and the tissue between ribs. There was a moment of resistance as it penetrated the pleural membrane, then a sudden give. Air hissed out through the catheter, a sound like a tire deflating. Olivia's body jerked, and she cried out a sharp sound of pain that cut through the ambient noise of the ER. But within seconds, her breathing changed. The rapid, shallow gasps began to deepen. Color started returning to her lips, the blue tinge fading to pink. Her oxygen saturation, which had been hovering in the low 80s, ticked upward on the monitor. Dr. Chen exhaled audibly. That was the right call. Ethan secured the catheter in place with tape and moved on to the next concern. The IVs were flowing, pumping fluids into her veins to maintain blood pressure, but the bleeding had to be controlled. He examined the wound on her side more carefully, noting the ragged edges and the depth. It looked like she'd been impaled on something during the crash, possibly part of the doorframe or a piece of broken glass. "We need to pack this," he gestured to the wound, "and we need pressure, but not so much that we compromise circulation." Working together now with more coordination, Ethan and Dr. Chen packed the wound with sterile gauze building layers that would slow the bleeding without cutting off blood flow to her leg. The charge nurse started a second IV line, giving them better access for blood products when they arrived. Olivia's hand found Ethan's wrist, her fingers wrapping around it with surprising strength. "Am I dying?" The question came out small and frightened, stripped of all pretense. Ethan looked directly into her eyes. "No. You're going to see the sunrise tomorrow. I promise you that." He had no business making such a promise. He'd learned in the military that you never promised a casualty they'd survive, because sometimes despite your best efforts, despite perfect technique and adequate supplies and ideal conditions, people still died. But something about this woman, something about the desperate hope in her eyes, made him speak with absolute certainty. The next 15 minutes passed in careful monitoring. Ethan stayed at Olivia's side, talking to her constantly, keeping her engaged and conscious. He asked about her job, her family, where she'd gone to school, anything to keep her mind active and prevent her from slipping away. She answered in fragments, her voice gaining slight strength as the fluids and his intervention stabilized her condition. She ran some kind of company, something about medical devices or pharmaceuticals. She lived in a high-rise near the lake. She was supposed to be at a board meeting tomorrow morning. The details emerged in pieces, painting a picture of a life very different from his own. Reyes finally arrived, bursting through the entrance, with his coat half soaked and his hair windblown. He took in the scene with experienced eyes, processing the situation in seconds. "Status." He directed the question at Dr. Chen while moving to scrub at the nearby sink. Chen rattled off the vitals and interventions while Reyes listened, his hands moving through the automatic motions of surgical prep. "Who did the needle decompression?" Chen gestured toward Ethan. "Him." Ward, the night security guard, former combat medic. Reyes glanced at Ethan, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once, a gesture of professional acknowledgement. "Good work. We'll take her from here." The surgical team appeared gowned and gloved, ready to transport Olivia to the OR. They worked with efficient speed, transferring monitors and IV lines, preparing her for movement. Ethan stepped back, his role finished. He'd done what needed to be done. Now the real experts would take over. As they began to wheel the gurney away, Olivia's hands shot out one more time, searching. Ethan caught it automatically, her fingers cold against his palm. "Thank you." The words were barely audible. "What's your name?" "Ethan Ward." She repeated it slowly, her eyes trying to focus on his face as the medication they'd given her started to take effect. "Ethan Ward, I won't forget." Then the surgical doors swung closed behind the gurney, and she disappeared into the sterile light beyond. The ER gradually returned to its normal rhythm, the crisis absorbed and processed and filed away. Dr. Chen touched Ethan's shoulder briefly. You saved her life. She paused, searching for words. Where did you learn to do that? Ethan picked up his security jacket, Amon, from where someone had draped it over a chair. The fabric was stained with Olivia's blood-dark patches spreading across the shoulder and sleeve. A long time ago, different place. He didn't elaborate. Dr. Chen seemed to sense that further questions wouldn't be welcome. She nodded and returned to her other patients, leaving Ethan standing alone near the entrance. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving behind the familiar hollowness that always followed intense action. His hands trembled slightly, a delayed stress response he'd learned to expect. He flexed his fingers, working feeling back into them, and realized he had been gripping Olivia's hand tighter than he'd intended. The mark of her fingers remained on his wrist, small red crescents where her nails had pressed into skin. The radio on his belt crackled. Ward, you there? Need you on third floor. Patient's family is causing a disturbance. He pressed the transmit button. On my way. The hospital needed him in his actual role, now the one he was paid to perform. He was security, not medical staff. Tonight had been an aberration, a moment when past and present collided and his old skills had been needed. But that moment was over. He returned to being invisible, just another uniform moving through the halls. The blood on his jacket would wash out eventually. Grace was sleeping when he checked the cafeteria 20 minutes later. She'd curled up on the vinyl bench near the windows, her head pillowed on her backpack. The math homework lay finished on the table, multiplication problems solved in her careful handwriting. Beside it, she'd drawn another picture in colored pencil. Ethan picked up the drawing carefully, not wanting to wake her. The image showed a man in a uniform standing beside what looked like a hospital bed. A woman lay on the bed and the man's hand was extended toward her. Above the scene, Grace had drawn a heart-colored, bright red with careful attention to staying inside the lines. At the bottom, in the wobbly letters of an 8-year-old still mastering cursive, she'd written, "My hero, Daddy." He stood there for a long moment, looking at the drawing, then at his sleeping daughter. Her face in sleep carried an innocence that the waking world tried constantly to strip away. She'd lost her mother 2 years ago and hadn't complained once about the strange life they now lived. She did her homework in hospital cafeterias. She fell asleep to the sound of PA announcements and the smell of antiseptic. She never asked for a different life because she understood with a child's instinctive wisdom that this was what they had to do. Ethan set the drawing back down gently and pulled off his blood-stained jacket, using it as an extra blanket to tuck around Grace's shoulders. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake, her breathing slow and even. The city lights beyond the windows painted the cafeteria in shifting shadows. Rain still fell, steadily washing the streets clean of the day's accumulation, preparing the ground for tomorrow's fresh start. Somewhere in the building above, Olivia Hart was being opened and repaired, her expensive life saved by a man whose name she probably wouldn't remember once the medications wore off. That was fine. Ethan didn't need her to remember. He needed to make sure Grace got to school on time tomorrow. He needed to finish his shift and drive them home through empty streets and make breakfast while she got ready for another day. He needed to be present for the small, crucial moments that built a childhood, because those moments were what mattered. The grand gestures, the dramatic saves, the moments when old skills suddenly became relevant again, those were aberrations. The real work of living happened in the quiet spaces between crises in the multiplication tables and colored pencil drawings and vinyl benches that smelled faintly of disinfectant and cafeteria food. His watch read 1:43 a.m., another 5 hours until his shift ended. He had rounds to make, doors to check, incidents to log in the security office. The rhythm of the job called him back, familiar and undemanding, asking nothing more than his presence and attention. Before he left the cafeteria, he glanced one more time at Grace's drawing. The little paper heart seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, a child's interpretation of something she'd heard about or intuited but couldn't fully understand. She knew her father had been a soldier once. She knew he'd helped people. But she didn't know the details, didn't understand the weight of those years, or the things he'd seen, or the reasons he'd walked away. Maybe someday he'd tell her. Maybe when she was older and could process such things without losing the innocence that still protected her from the world's harder truths. For now, she just knew he was her dad, and that was enough. Ethan pulled the cafeteria door closed softly behind him and returned to the empty hallways, his footsteps echoing against polished floors. 3 days passed before Olivia Hart opened her eyes to anything resembling consciousness. The surgery had taken 7 hours, repairing damage to her spleen, liver, and left lung. Dr. Reyes had performed what he later described to colleagues as some of the most delicate work of his career, navigating scar tissue and traumatized organs with microscopic precision. She woke to whiteness, white ceiling tiles, white walls, white sheets tucked precisely around her body. The only color came from the monitors beside her bed, their screens displaying vital signs in blues and greens and reds. An IV line snaked into her left arm. Another tube emerged from beneath the sheets, draining fluid from her surgical site. Pain announced itself, slowly building from a dull ache to something sharper as her nervous system came back online. Every breath hurt. Moving her head made the room spin. She tried to speak and discovered her throat was raw, damaged from the breathing tube they'd used during surgery. A nurse appeared at her bedside, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and efficient hands. "Welcome back, Ms. Hart. You're at St. Haven Hospital. You were in a car accident, but you're going to be fine. Just try to relax." Olivia's mind felt clouded thoughts moving through thick fog. She had fragmentary memories of the accident, of her car hydroplaning on the bridge, of the sickening crunch as metal met concrete. Then nothing but pain and fear and a desperate desire for it all to end. But someone had stopped that ending. Someone had pulled her back from the edge and made her promises in a voice that brooked no argument. Who? The word came out as a croak, barely intelligible. The nurse adjusted her IV flow. "Who what, honey? Who saved me?" The nurse smiled. "Dr. Reyes performed your surgery. He's excellent. One of the best trauma surgeons in the Midwest." Olivia shook her head slightly, immediately regretting the movement as pain spiked through her skull. "Before. In the ER. Who was there?" The nurse paused, considering. "Let me check your chart." She moved to the computer station mounted on the wall and began scrolling through records. "Looks like Dr. Chen was the attending physician when you arrived. The paramedics who brought you in were Rodriguez and Chen." And she squinted at the screen. "It mentions here that one of our security staff assisted with stabilization. Ethan Ward, Ethan Ward." The name clicked into place with the face she remembered, pale under fluorescent lights. Rain-soaked hair plastered to his forehead, eyes that looked directly at her without flinching from what they saw. "Is he?" Olivia's voice failed her. She swallowed painfully and tried again. "Is he a doctor?" "No, honey. He's security, works the night shift. But apparently he used to be a medic in the Army. Lucky for you, he was there." Lucky. The word felt inadequate for what had happened. Someone working as security, earning probably a fraction of what she made in a year, had stepped forward with skills that saved her life. Had touched her with gentle, competent hands and refused to let her give up. Had promised her the sunrise. She'd seen that sunrise now. 3 of them, in fact, though she'd been unconscious for the first 2. The nurse had opened the blinds to let in morning light, and beyond the window, Chicago stretched toward the lake in shades of gray and gold. The door opened and Marcus Chen entered, his tablet already glowing in his hand. Her assistant had worked for her for 5 years, coordinating schedules and managing communications with the efficiency of a Swiss watch. He'd been with her through product launches and hostile takeovers and quarterly reports that made or broke careers. But she'd never seen his face do what it did when he saw her awake. Relief flooded his features, followed immediately by tears that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. He set the tablet down on the chair and approached her bed carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter. "Oh, thank God." His voice broke. "We thought the doctors said it was close. Really close." Olivia managed a weak smile. "Takes more than a bridge to kill me." Marcus laughed, the sound wet and thick. Then, because he was Marcus and his brain never truly stopped working, his expression shifted to something more calculated. "The press is going crazy. The accident made headlines. There's been a lot of speculation about your condition, about what happened. This could actually be good for the Foundation's profile if we handle it right. Human interest angle, you know. CEO survives near-death experience, gains new perspective on healthcare access." Even through the medication fog, Olivia recognized the trajectory of his thoughts. Turn crisis into opportunity. Transform personal trauma into corporate narrative. It was good strategy, the kind of thinking that had helped build Hart Industries into a pharmaceutical powerhouse. But something about it felt wrong. This time felt like a violation of something sacred. "Who saved me, Marcus?" She asked the question even though she already knew the answer. "The surgical team. Dr. Reyes, specifically. He's apparently legendary in trauma circles. Before the surgery, In the ER. Who kept me alive? Marcus consulted his tablet, scrolling through notes. The paramedics did initial stabilization. Dr. Chen was the attending. He paused, reading further. There's a mention of hospital security assisting, but that's probably just procedural. His name. Give me his name. Marcus looked up, confusion evident. Ward. Ethan Ward. Why does it matter? Because Olivia closed her eyes, suddenly exhausted. Because he was there when it mattered. She heard Marcus typing on his tablet, searching for information. Okay, so Ethan Ward, 38 years old, former military discharged 2 years ago, currently employed as night security at St. Haven. Before you ask, his employment record is clean, no complaints, no issues, just a guy doing his job. Just a guy. The description felt like an insult to what she remembered, to the steady authority in his voice and the certainty in his hands. Find out more about him. Olivia opened her eyes again, focusing on Marcus with as much intensity as she could muster. I want to know everything. Why he left the military, why he's working security. Everything. Marcus's expression shifted to something more predatory, the look he got when sensing an angle. This is brilliant. Seriously brilliant. Wounded veteran working as security saves prominent CEO. This is exactly the kind of story that resonates. We can build an entire campaign around this. Maybe offer him a position with the foundation, really lean into the gratitude angle. The optics would be incredible. Olivia felt something twist in her stomach, a sensation that had nothing to do with her surgical wounds. Just find the information. We'll discuss what to do with it later. After Marcus left, she lay in the white room and thought about the man who'd saved her life. She remembered the way he'd looked at her, not with the careful deference she was used to from employees and subordinates, but with a kind of fierce determination that transcended social hierarchy. In that moment, she hadn't been Olivia Hart, CEO of Hart Industries. She'd been just another casualty, and he'd been the one person capable of preventing her death. The realization made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Ethan Ward learned about Olivia's recovery, the way he learned about most things at the hospital, through overheard conversations and casual mentions during shift change. A nurse mentioned that the woman from the bridge accident had woken up. Someone else said she was expected to make a full recovery. Reyes received compliments from colleagues on the complexity of the surgery. No one mentioned Ethan's name. No one connected the security guard walking the third-floor hallway with the person who'd kept Olivia Hart alive long enough for the surgery to matter. That suited him fine. He'd done what needed doing. The recognition, or lack thereof, changed nothing about the outcome. Grace noticed the blood-stained jacket before he could hide it. She'd found it stuffed in the bottom of his locker when she'd gone looking for quarters for the vending machine. Her small face went pale. "Daddy, are you hurt?" He'd knelt down to her level, taking her hands in his. "No, sweetheart. I'm fine. I helped someone who was hurt, and I got a little messy. That's all." Her eyes so much like her mother's, it sometimes hurt to look at them directly, studied his face for signs of deception. "Did they die, Num? She's going to be okay." Grace had hugged him then, wrapping her thin arms around his neck with fierce intensity. "You're a good person, Daddy." The simple statement, delivered with a child's absolute certainty, had nearly broken him. He'd held her for a long moment, breathing in the smell of her strawberry shampoo and the faint scent of the hospital cafeteria that clung to her clothes. Later that night, after Grace had fallen asleep on her usual bench, Ethan stood in the hospital's administrative wing, looking at the framed newspaper clipping behind glass. He'd passed it 100 times before without paying much attention. Now he studied the photograph of Olivia Hart shaking hands with the mayor, her smile bright and professional, her posture perfect. The caption praised her philanthropic commitment, $10 million pledged to improve healthcare access in underserved communities. $10 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, disconnected from reality. Ethan's annual salary was $42,000. Grace's school supplies cost $300 a year. Their rent ate up most of his paycheck. The universe Olivia inhabited, where $10 million could be pledged with a handshake and a smile, existed so far beyond his experience that trying to imagine it felt pointless. He wondered if she'd remember his name. Probably not. People in her position interacted with hundreds of people daily. Service workers blurred together, became interchangeable parts in the machinery that kept their lives running smoothly. The security guard who'd helped her would file away with the paramedics and nurses and orderlies, a collective effort with no individual faces. That was fine. That was how it should be. His world and hers existed in parallel tracks, occasionally intersecting, but never truly merging. He'd stepped into her life for one crucial moment, and now he'd step back out. The natural order would reassert itself. A week passed. Olivia remained in the hospital, recovering slowly. Ethan saw her name on the VIP patient list, noted the private room assignment, and the enhanced security protocols. He made sure to avoid that wing during his rounds, not wanting any awkward encounters. Grace's school life continued with its usual rhythms. She struggled with fractions. She made a new friend named Sophie, who liked drawing as much as she did. She brought home a permission slip for a field trip to the Museum of Science and Industry that cost $15 Ethan didn't really have, but would find anyway. The world kept turning. Bills arrived. The truck's check engine light came on. The upstairs neighbors fought at 2 in the morning, their voices carrying through thin walls. Grace lost a tooth and put it under her pillow, receiving 5 quarters in return, carefully chosen to feel like more money than it actually was. On the 8th night after the accident, Ethan was checking the vending machines on the 4th floor when his radio crackled with an unusual request. "Ward, can you come to the administrative office? Director wants to see you." He acknowledged the call and made his way down 2 floors, wondering what could have prompted the summons. The director of security, a retired cop named Morrison, ran a tight ship, but generally left the night guards alone as long as they did their jobs competently. Morrison's office smelled like coffee and old paper. The man himself sat behind a cluttered desk, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed something on his computer screen. "Ward, have a seat." Ethan sat in the worn chair across from the desk, waiting. Morrison looked up over his glasses. "Got an interesting call today from Hart Industries. Seems their CEO wants to thank you personally for what you did last week. They're requesting a meeting." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's not necessary, sir." "Maybe not, but they're being pretty insistent. And given that Hart Industries is one of our biggest donors, it would be, let's say, politically advantageous to accommodate the request." "With respect, sir, I'd prefer not to. I was just doing what needed to be done." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan with the assessing gaze of someone who'd spent 30 years reading people. "I pulled your military file. Silver Star, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal with Valor. 16 years of distinguished service." He paused. "You didn't mention any of that when you applied for this job." "It didn't seem relevant." "Didn't seem." Morrison shook his head slowly. "Most guys with your record would be leading with it, looking for positions that paid better than security. But here you are working nights for barely above minimum wage." Why? Ethan met his gaze steadily. "Because the hours let me be with my daughter. That's what matters." Morrison nodded slowly, respect showing in his expression. "I can't force you to take the meeting, but I'm asking you to consider it. Not for the company politics, but because sometimes when people want to say thank you, the gracious thing is to let them." Ethan thought about Grace, about her school trip, and the check engine light, and the slowly accumulating reality that $42,000 a year would never be quite enough when they suggested tomorrow afternoon. "Your shift doesn't start until 10. You'd be back in plenty of time." Ethan stood. "Tell them I'll be there." The meeting was arranged for 2 in the afternoon at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital. Neutral ground, Marcus had suggested somewhere private, but not intimidating. Olivia had agreed, though she suspected nowhere would feel truly neutral when the power differential was so stark. She arrived 15 minutes early, moving slowly with the careful deliberation of someone whose body still remembered its trauma. The surgical incisions pulled with each step. Breathing deeply remained uncomfortable, but she'd insisted on attending, without assistance, needing to do this herself. The coffee shop was the kind of place that served $7 lattes to people who worked in nearby office buildings. Exposed brick walls, Edison bulb lighting, a chalkboard menu featuring drinks with names like The Existentialist and Bourgeois Guilt Extra Foam. Olivia ordered something with espresso and almond milk and settled into a corner booth where she could watch the door. Ethan arrived exactly on time, dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt that had been pressed carefully. He looked different in civilian clothes, younger somehow, though the wariness in his eyes aged him beyond his years. He spotted her immediately and approached the booth with the same economical movements she remembered from the ER. "Ms. Hart, She gestured to the seat across from her. Please sit. Can I get you something coffee food? I'm fine, thank you. An awkward silence settled between them. Olivia found herself struggling for words, something that happened rarely in her professional life. She'd rehearsed this conversation with Marcus, planned out talking points and strategic approaches. All of it evaporated in the presence of the actual man. I wanted to thank you, the words came out simpler than she'd intended. For what you did, the doctor said if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't known what to do. I'm glad you are recovering well. Another silence. Ethan's posture remained close-guarded. He sat with his back to the wall, his eyes occasionally scanning the room in automatic threat assessment. Military habits died hard. Olivia pushed forward. I've been thinking about how to properly express my gratitude. Money seems crude and I'm sure you'd refuse anyway. She smiled, trying for warmth. So I wanted to offer you something more meaningful, a position with the Heart Foundation. We're expanding our healthcare access initiatives and we need someone with your expertise to help develop programs for veterans and underserved communities. Ethan's expression didn't change. That's very generous, but I have a job. As security, Marcus told me you're making, what, $40,000 a year. We could offer you triple that. Good benefits, normal hours, the chance to actually use your skills to help people on a larger scale. She watched him process the offer, saw something flicker behind his eyes. Temptation, maybe, or calculation. But when he spoke, his voice remained level. I appreciate the offer, Ms. Hart, but I'll have to decline. Olivia felt a spike of frustration. She was offering him an escape from a dead-end job, a chance to build something meaningful. Why would anyone refuse that? May I ask why? Because. Ethan's gaze met hers directly. Because I don't think you're offering this because you think I'm the best person for the job. You're offering it because you feel obligated and because it makes for good optics. Wounded veteran gets second chance from grateful CEO. It's a nice story. But I'm not interested in being your story. The words landed like physical blows. Olivia felt heat rising to her face, a combination of embarrassment and anger. That's not fair. I'm trying to do something good here. Are you? Ethan leaned forward slightly. Or are you trying to make yourself feel better about the fact that you needed help, that you were vulnerable, that someone you would never have noticed otherwise had to save your life? The accusation hung in the air between them. Olivia wanted to deny it, to defend her intentions as purely altruistic, but she couldn't quite manage the lie. I notice people. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Do you? Ethan's tone remained gentle, but the question cut deep. When's the last time you learned the name of someone who cleaned your office, or the security guard at your building, or the person who made your coffee this morning? Olivia didn't answer. She couldn't. I'm not trying to be cruel, Ethan continued. I'm just being honest. You live in a world where people like me are supposed to be invisible. We exist to make your life run smoothly, and in return, we stay out of sight. What happened last week broke that pattern, and now you're trying to restore order the only way you know how. With money, with position, with grand gestures. So what should I do? The question came out more desperate than she'd intended. Just pretend it didn't happen. Move on like you didn't save my life. Ethan stood, preparing to leave. You don't owe me anything, Ms. Hart. Not gratitude, not money, not a job. You don't even owe me recognition. What you owe yourself is to live better than you did before. That's all I ask. Live like someone who got a second chance. He walked away without looking back, leaving Olivia sitting in the coffee shop booth with $7 almond milk latte going cold in front of her. Through the window, she watched him disappear into the afternoon crowd, just another person in jeans and a pressed shirt navigating the city's sidewalks. She'd been dismissed, not with anger or resentment, but with a kind of patient firmness, like a teacher correcting a student who should have known better. The realization stung more than any harsh words could have. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus asking how the meeting went. She stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a reply. It didn't. That night, after returning home to her penthouse and spending hours staring at the lake beyond her windows, Olivia made a decision. If Ethan Ward didn't want recognition, she would honor that choice. She would construct a narrative that protected his privacy while still acknowledging the hospital's care. She drafted a statement with Marcus's help, carefully worded to express gratitude without naming names. She praised the paramedics and the ER staff and Dr. Reyes's surgical skill. She announced an additional donation to the hospital's emergency services fund. She thanked the entire St. Haven team for their professionalism and expertise. Ethan Ward's name appeared nowhere in the statement. It wasn't mentioned in any of the follow-up interviews. When reporters asked specifically about who had stabilized her before the surgeon arrived, she smiled and said vaguely that the hospital staff had been incredible, that she owed her life to their collective effort. It was the truth after a fashion, just not the whole truth. And with each repetition of the edited version, she felt the weight of what she was erasing. A man had stepped forward when it mattered most, had used skills earned through service and sacrifice, had refused to let her quit. And in return, she was making him invisible again, exactly as he'd predicted. But he'd asked for this, hadn't he? He'd made it clear he didn't want recognition. She was respecting his wishes. The fact that his wishes happened to align with her own desire to control the narrative, to avoid the uncomfortable reality of her dependence, that was just convenient coincidence. At least that's what she told herself as she fell asleep in her 1,000 thread-count sheets 19 floors above the city, where Ethan Ward was probably making his rounds through empty hospital corridors. The story hit the news cycle exactly as Marcus predicted. CEO survives near-death experience. Pledges increased support for emergency services. Gains new perspective on healthcare access and the importance of well-funded trauma care. The photograph showed Olivia looking appropriately grateful and reflective, her recovery framed as inspiration rather than vulnerability. Hard industry stock ticked up 2 points. The foundation received a surge in donations. Olivia's social media following increased by 40,000 people overnight, all of them drawn to the narrative of survival and renewed purpose. It was good publicity, good business, good strategy. And it was a lie, or at least an incomplete truth, and Olivia found she couldn't quite forget that fact, no matter how many people congratulated her on handling the situation so gracefully. Ethan saw the news coverage during his dinner break, the television in the staff cafeteria playing CNN while he ate a sandwich Grace had helped him pack that morning. His name wasn't mentioned. His role had been absorbed into the collective achievement of hospital staff. He felt nothing about the omission, no anger or disappointment, just a quiet confirmation that his assessment had been correct. Olivia Hart had needed to make him disappear, and so he had disappeared. The world worked exactly as he'd known it would. Grace looked up from her homework when he turned off the television. Who was that lady? Just someone I helped at work. Is she nice? Ethan considered the question. Nice felt like an inadequate descriptor for someone as complicated as Olivia Hart clearly was. I think, he said slowly, she's trying to be, and sometimes that's what matters. Grace nodded, satisfied with the answer in the way children are when they trust their parent to tell them truth. She returned to her math problems while Ethan finished his sandwich and prepared for the second half of his shift. 2 weeks after the accident, Olivia returned to St. Haven for her follow-up appointment. She'd scheduled it, carefully choosing a time when the hospital would be busy with day staff, when the night security guard who'd saved her life would be at home sleeping. But fate or chance or simple bad timing intervened. As she walked through the main lobby toward the elevator bank, moving slowly and carefully because her ribs still protested sudden movements, she saw him. Ethan Ward stood near the vending machines talking to a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The child had dark hair pulled into pigtails, and she was laughing at something he'd said, her whole face lighting up with joy. He smiled down at her with an expression of such tender affection that it transformed his features, made him look younger and less guarded than Olivia had ever seen him. She stopped walking, frozen in place. The little girl had to be his daughter. The resemblance was there in the shape of their faces, the color of their eyes. And watching them together, seeing the easy intimacy of their interaction, Olivia understood something she'd missed before. This was why he worked security, despite having skills that could command better pay elsewhere. This was why he'd turned down her job offer without hesitation. Not because he was proud or stubborn, but because his current job let him keep his daughter close, let him be present in her life in ways that a normal 9-to-5 couldn't accommodate. He'd sacrificed career advancement for fatherhood, had chosen presence over prestige. The realization made Olivia feel small and shallow, her own priorities suddenly thrown into sharp relief. She could have turned around, could have taken a different elevator, could have avoided this encounter entirely. But something pulled her forward, some need for resolution or understanding that overrode her instinct for self-protection. Ethan. His name came out before she could second-guess herself. He turned at the sound, recognized her immediately. His expression shifted to something neutral and professional, the guard going up. Ms. Hart. The little girl looked between them with open curiosity, clearly trying to figure out the connection. I wanted to apologize. Olivia forced herself to continue despite the growing awkwardness. For the coffee shop. I shouldn't have assumed you'd want what I was offering. It's fine. Ethan's tone remained carefully neutral. You were trying to do something kind. I appreciate the intention. Silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. The little girl tugged on Ethan's sleeve. Dad, can we get chips from the machine, one bag? His voice changed completely when he spoke to his daughter, becoming warmer and gentler. And you're sharing with me. The girl beamed and ran to the vending machine, studying the options with serious concentration. She's beautiful. Olivia surprised herself by speaking. Your daughter, thank you. More silence. Olivia searched for something else to say, some way to bridge the gulf between them that felt wider than professional or economic status. I kept your name out of the press coverage. Like you wanted. Ethan nodded once. I saw. Thank you for respecting that. But I wanted you to know. Olivia met his eyes directly. What you did mattered. What you said to me mattered. I haven't forgotten. Good. Ethan's expression remained neutral. Then don't forget the important part. Live better. Make it count. Before she could respond, his daughter returned with a bag of chips, holding it up triumphantly. I got the barbecue ones. Perfect choice. Ethan took the bag and opened it, offering her first pick. The little girl glanced back at Olivia and waved with innocent friendliness, clearly unburdened by any adult awkwardness about social hierarchies or uncomfortable conversations. Olivia lifted her hand, automatically returning the wave with a small smile that felt genuine despite everything. Then Ethan and his daughter walked away down the hallway, her small hand reaching up to grab his larger one, her voice chattering happily about something that had happened at school. They disappeared around the corner, and Olivia was left standing alone near the vending machines, listening to their footsteps fade into the general ambient sound of the hospital. A doctor walked past without looking at her. Two nurses chatted near the elevator about weekend plans. An orderly pushed a cart of linens toward the service elevator. Life continued exactly as it always had, as if the encounter that felt monumental to Olivia had been just another brief interaction in a place where thousands of such moments happened daily. She made her way to the appointment, answered Dorea's questions about pain levels and mobility, scheduled another follow-up for next month. The entire time, her mind kept returning to the image of Ethan walking away with his daughter, the two of them self-contained and complete, needing nothing from the world except to be left alone to build their small, quiet life together. That evening, Grace burst into the hospital cafeteria waving a bright yellow flyer like a victory flag. Ethan looked up from the incident report he was filling out, one of the endless small tasks that filled the quiet hours of his shift. Dad, book. Her excitement filled the small space, drawing smiles from the two nurses who were taking their dinner break at a nearby table. What have you got, kiddo? She spread the flyer on the table in front of him, smoothing it carefully. Hart Industries is donating computers to my school. 20 new ones for the library, and tablets for every classroom. Miss Anderson told us today. She says we'll be able to do coding classes and everything. Ethan studied the flyer, which featured the Hart Industries logo prominently and included a photograph of Olivia Hart shaking hands with the school principal. The announcement praised the importance of technology education and Hart Industries' commitment to supporting Chicago public schools. That's great, sweetheart. Grace climbed onto the bench beside him, swinging her legs and humming to herself. Miss Hart is really nice, huh? Doing stuff like this for kids. Ethan looked out the window without answering immediately. Far below, a black limousine was pulling away from the hospital's front entrance, moving slowly through the evening traffic. Through the tinted rear window, he could just make out a silhouette, someone sitting in the back seat, staring up toward the building, as if looking for something or someone. For a brief moment, their eyes seemed to meet across the distance, across the glass and steel and empty air between their worlds. Then the car turned the corner and disappeared into the flow of the city. Yeah, kiddo. Ethan returned his attention to his daughter, to the flyer, announcing technology donations, to the simple brightness in her eyes that came from believing the world contained good people who did good things. I think she's trying to be. Grace nodded satisfied with his answer and returned to coloring a picture she'd started earlier. The image showed their apartment building with a bright sun overhead, stick figures of the two of them standing in front holding hands. Simple and honest and containing everything that mattered. Ethan filed away the incident report and checked his watch. Another 3 hours until his shift ended. Then they'd drive home through empty streets while the sun came up and he'd make scrambled eggs, while Grace got ready for school, and she'd catch the bus while he tried to sleep on the couch with the television playing quietly. The same routine they'd followed for 2 years now. The same careful balance between his need to work and her need for stability. Nothing had changed, not really. Olivia Hart had entered their lives briefly dramatically, and now she would exit the same way, leaving behind only the ripples of her presence. That's what Ethan told himself as he stood and gathered the coloring supplies to pack up for the night. That's what he needed to believe as he walked the familiar hallways, checking doors and monitoring security feeds, and existing in the background of other people's emergencies. But deep down in a place he didn't examine too closely, he suspected this wasn't over. Suspected that their paths would cross again, despite his best efforts to maintain separation. Suspected that Olivia Hart, for all her wealth and power and carefully controlled image, was someone who didn't leave things unfinished. The thought should have worried him. Instead, it just made him tired, the kind of weariness that came from knowing the quiet life he'd built might not stay quiet much longer. Grace finished her picture and held it up for his inspection. "What do you think? It's perfect?" And he meant it, because the stick figures might be simple, but the love they represented was the most complicated and important thing in his world. They left the cafeteria together, Grace's small hand in his, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she chattered about the coding classes she'd get to take once the new computers arrived. Behind them, the television continued playing news coverage. Another story about Hart Industries' charitable initiatives, another carefully constructed narrative about doing good in the world. Ethan didn't look back. He focused on his daughter, on the hallways they needed to walk, on the hours remaining in his shift. The present demanded enough attention. The future, with all its complications and uncertainties, would arrive whether he worried about it or not. For now, this was enough. Grace's hand in his. The knowledge that Olivia Hart would recover. The sunset giving way to night beyond the hospital windows. The small, steady rhythm of a life built from necessity and sacrifice and love. It had to be enough, because it was all he had. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, Olivia stood in her corner office on the 40th floor, staring at a personnel file that shouldn't have existed on her desk. The manila folder felt heavy in her hands, weighted with information that Marcus had compiled with his usual efficiency and complete lack of ethical boundaries. Ward Ethan Michael, date of birth, March 14, 1987. The photograph clipped to the first page showed a younger man in full military dress uniform, his face harder and leaner than she remembered, his eyes carrying a distance that came from seeing things civilians couldn't imagine. She flipped through pages documenting a career most people would have broadcast proudly. 3 combat deployments, 16 years of service. The commendations read like a catalog of heroism rendered in bureaucratic language. Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry during enemy engagement, rescuing wounded personnel under direct fire. Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device for extraordinary achievement in medical treatment of casualties during sustained combat operations. Purple Heart for wounds received in action. The medical section contained details that made her chest tighten. Shrapnel wounds to left shoulder and torso sustained while providing aid to wounded soldiers during mortar attack. Full recovery, returned to active duty after 6 weeks. Treated for acute stress reaction following incident involving civilian casualties. Mandatory counseling completed. Cleared for continued service. But the file that Marcus had assembled didn't stop at military service. It traced the fracture point where everything changed. Ward Claire Marie, deceased. The death certificate was attached, its clinical language unable to mask the tragedy it documented. Motor vehicle collision, Interstate 294 southbound lanes. Time of death, 11:47 p.m. Caused blunt force trauma, multiple internal injuries. Blood alcohol content of other driver 0.19, nearly twice the legal limit. Olivia's hands trembled slightly as she read the accident report. Claire Ward had been driving home from her sister's house in the suburbs. Their daughter, then 6 years old, had been at home with a babysitter. The drunk driver had crossed the median at 70 miles per hour, turning a Wednesday night into the moment that redefined an entire family's future. The next document showed Ethan's discharge papers, honorable separation under family hardship provision, recommended for promotion to warrant officer recommendation withdrawn at service member's request. Separation benefits standard. Post-service employment assistance declined. He'd walked away from everything, from a career, from rank and pension, and the structured identity the military provided. He'd chosen his daughter over advancement presence, over prestige, and apparently never looked back. The final pages in Marcus's file contained financial records that shouldn't have been accessible, but somehow were. Current annual income, $42,000. Monthly expenses, rent, those are $400 utilities, $200 groceries, $450 vehicle payment, $380 medical insurance, $520. The numbers barely balanced. Every month represented a tightrope walk between stability and crisis. Olivia closed the file and set it on her desk, feeling dirty in ways that had nothing to do with physical contamination. She'd authorized this invasion of privacy, had nodded when Marcus suggested they needed to understand who they were dealing with. Now, holding the documented evidence of Ethan Ward's sacrifice and struggle, she understood exactly what she'd done. She'd reduced a human being to data points, had turned someone's grief and choice and daily survival into information to be analyzed and leveraged. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Foundation Gala tonight. Car picks you up at 6. Dresses in your closet. The annual Heart Foundation Gala. 500 guests each paying $1,000 per plate, raising money for healthcare initiatives that sounded impressive in press releases, but often translated to minimal real-world impact. Olivia attended every year, gave the same speech about innovation and community investment, smiled for photographs with board members and major donors. This year felt different. This year, she couldn't stop thinking about the gap between what the foundation claimed to accomplish and what actually changed in people's lives. The gap between writing checks and creating genuine transformation. The gap between who she wanted to be and who she actually was. The grand ballroom at the Merchandise Mart glittered like a contained galaxy. Crystal chandeliers threw prismatic light across marble floors polished to mirror brightness. Round tables draped in white linen filled the space, each centerpiece a small fortune in orchids and roses. A string quartet played near the entrance, their music barely audible over the conversation of 500 wealthy people discussing vacation homes and stock portfolios. Olivia moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her midnight blue gown, chosen specifically to convey sophistication without ostentation. She shook hands, accepted congratulations on her recovery, deflected questions about the accident with vague mentions of being grateful for excellent medical care. Marcus stayed 3 steps behind her, his tablet glowing as he monitored social media mentions and coordinated with the photographer. The event was proceeding exactly according to plan. The right people were talking to each other. The press coverage would be positive. The foundation's profile would rise another incremental notch. Everything was perfect and perfectly hollow. Ethan stood against the back wall in an ill-fitting security uniform borrowed from the company that provided event staff. He'd been called in at the last minute when another guard canceled the shift coordinator, offering double pay for working on short notice. Double pay meant he could fix the truck's check engine light and still have money left over for Grace's field trip. So here he stood watching wealthy people celebrate their own generosity while servers in white gloves circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per bite than his hourly wage. He'd recognized Olivia the moment she entered. Hard not to given that her face was on banners hanging throughout the ballroom and printed in the event program every guest received. She looked different than in the hospital, polished and perfect, every hair in place, and every gesture calculated for maximum effect. This was her world. These were her people. And watching her navigate the crowd with easy confidence, Ethan felt the full weight of the distance between their lives. She belonged here among the crystal and champagne. He belonged in hospital corridors and vinyl cafeteria booths in the spaces people with real money never saw. The evening progressed through its scheduled beats. Cocktails gave way to dinner. Dinner transitioned to speeches. Olivia took the stage under a spotlight that made her gown shimmer like water and delivered remarks about innovation and community investment and building a better future for Chicago's children. Her voice carried perfectly across the ballroom, confident and smooth, hitting all the right emotional notes. The audience applauded at appropriate moments, their champagne glasses catching light as they raised them in support of her vision. Ethan listened from his position near the emergency exit and heard everything she didn't say. Heard the careful construction of each phrase designed to inspire without committing to anything specific. Heard the gaps where actual impact should have been measured and reported. Heard the performance of caring rather than caring itself. Then the fire alarm shattered the careful choreography. The sound was deafening, echoing off the high ceilings and marble floors. For a split second, the crowd froze, uncertainty rippling through the ballroom. Then someone screamed and chaos erupted instantly. 500 people in formal wear surged toward the exits. Women in heels stumbled. Men shoved past each other. The orderly elegance of moments before dissolved into pure panic as thick smoke began pouring from the kitchen area, dark and acrid. Ethan moved on instinct, his training overriding conscious thought. He positioned himself at the nearest exit, directing the flow of bodies, keeping people from trampling each other in their desperation to escape. Single file, keep moving but don't run. Stay low if the smoke gets thick. His voice cut through the panic with command authority, the tone that had once directed entire platoons under fire. People responded automatically, their hindbrain recognizing leadership and latching onto it. The ballroom emptied rapidly, the crowd streaming through multiple exits toward the street. Within 90 seconds, most guests had evacuated. Ethan did a quick scan for stragglers and saw him. An elderly man, 70 at least, clutching his chest near the bar. His face had gone gray, lips tinged with blue. As Ethan watched, the man's knees buckled, and he collapsed hard onto the marble floor. People stepped around him in their rush for the exits, too panicked to stop, too frightened to help. They flowed past like water around a stone, their survival instinct overriding any impulse toward assistance. Ethan shoved through the diminishing crowd and dropped to his knees beside the fallen man, 2 fingers to the carotid artery. Pulse present, but irregular, weak and thready, breathing shallow and labored. Classic presentation of cardiac arrest in progress. He tilted the man's head back to clear the airway and began chest compressions immediately. 30 beats hard and fast the way he'd been trained. Push fast, push hard, allow full chest recoil between compressions. 2 rescue breaths. Then again, and again. The ballroom continued emptying around him. Smoke thickened overhead, forming a layer that descended gradually. The fire alarm shriek became white noise background to the rhythm of compressions and breaths. Ethan's world narrowed to the mechanics of CPR and the body beneath his hands. Nothing else mattered. Not the smoke or the alarm, or the hundreds of people fleeing. Just this one life, this one moment, this one chance to refuse death. On the stage, Olivia stood frozen. The evacuation plan called for her to leave immediately to exit through the VIP route that would take her directly to a waiting car. Marcus was pulling at her arm, trying to guide her towards safety, but she couldn't move. Couldn't look away from the man in the security uniform, kneeling on marble floors, his hands moving with mechanical precision, his complete focus on the elderly man whose life was draining away. Everyone else had run. Everyone else had prioritized their own safety over a stranger's crisis. But Ethan Ward had moved toward danger without hesitation, had dropped to his knees in a smoke-filled ballroom, and started the desperate work of keeping someone alive. She watched his face completely calm, despite the chaos, saw the same fierce determination she remembered from the night he'd saved her life. This was who he was when no cameras were watching, when there was no recognition or reward. This was the truth beneath the security uniform and the quiet demeanor and the carefully maintained invisibility. The elderly man suddenly coughed violently, his body convulsing. Ethan immediately rolled him into recovery position, supporting his head and ensuring the airway remained clear. The man's eyes opened, confused and terrified. Paramedics burst through the entrance, their equipment rattling as they rushed toward Ethan's position. He gave them a rapid status update, professional and precise, then stepped back to let them take over. The remaining guests who hadn't evacuated broke into spontaneous applause. Ethan ignored them, standing slowly and wiping sweat from his forehead. His shirt was damp, his tie askew. His hands, which had been moving with such certainty moments before, trembled slightly now that the adrenaline was receding. He glanced toward the stage and his eyes met Olivia's across the smoke-hazed distance. Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken recognition that shifted the ground beneath their previous interactions. For the first time, she truly saw him, not as a convenient narrative or a source of guilt or an opportunity for corporate goodwill, but as a person who possessed qualities she'd spent her entire life claiming to value while never actually embodying them herself. Marcus was still pulling at her arm, his voice sharp with urgency about getting her to safety. But Olivia pulled free from his grip and walked toward Ethan through the thinning smoke, her expensive heels clicking on marble that was now streaked with scuff marks and spilled champagne. Ethan watched her approach, his expression guarded but not hostile. "You should evacuate Ms. Hart. The building hasn't been cleared yet." "I know." Her voice came out softer than she intended. "I just wanted to say that was incredible. What you did, it's what anyone should have done. But they didn't." She gestured toward the now empty ballroom, toward the evidence of 500 people who had prioritized themselves over a stranger in crisis. "Only you did." Ethan's jaw tightened, and she saw frustration flicker across his features. "This isn't about me being special or heroic. It's about everyone else being trained to only care about themselves. The fact that helping someone in need seems remarkable says more about society than it does about me." The words landed like accusations, which perhaps they were meant to be. Olivia felt them settle into her chest, adding weight to the growing collection of uncomfortable truths she could no longer ignore. Firefighters entered the ballroom, their equipment heavy and purposeful. The fire had been contained to the kitchen, an overheated deep fryer that had ignited nearby materials. Minimal damage, no injuries beyond the elderly man's cardiac event. The crisis was over. Ethan turned to leave his job finished, but Olivia's voice stopped him. "Wait, please." He paused but didn't turn around. "I need to talk to you, really talk, not like at the coffee shop. Not me offering things you don't want. Just honest conversation. About what? About how I can actually help. Not to make myself feel better. Not for publicity, but to genuinely create change in a way that matters." Ethan did turn, then his eyes searching her face for signs of performance or calculation. "Why the sudden interest in authenticity, Ms. Hart? What changed watching you?" Her answer came out more raw than she'd intended. "Watching you do the right thing twice now, while everyone else, myself included, stood around being useless. Watching you sacrifice advancement and comfort to be present for your daughter. Watching you refuse to cash in on saving my life because you saw through my bullshit." The vulgarity seemed to surprise him. Olivia rarely cursed, found it unprofessional in most contexts. But nothing about this moment felt professional. "You want to help." Ethan's voice remained level. "Then stop treating charity like a PR campaign. Stop writing checks to causes that look good in press releases. Actually show up, actually do the work. Actually give a damn about whether your money creates real change or just generates positive headlines." "How do I do that?" The question came out small, almost pleading. "I don't know where to start." Ethan studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing whether she was serious or just performing sincerity for an audience of one. "Start by listening to people who actually need help, not to your board of directors or your publicist or whoever tells you what will generate the best optics. Listen to the night shift nurses who can't afford childcare, to the veterans who can't navigate the VA system, to the families living paycheck to paycheck, one emergency away from homelessness. Listen to them and then ask what they actually need instead of assuming you know better." The firefighters motioned for them to evacuate. The building needed to be fully inspected before anyone could remain inside. Ethan nodded acknowledgement and started toward the exit. Olivia followed, her gown gathering smoke, smell, and debris as she walked. Outside, the street had transformed into organized chaos. Guests clustered in groups, some wrapped in borrowed coats against the October chill. Emergency vehicles blocked traffic, their lights painting everything in alternating reds and blues. News cameras had arrived, drawn by the combination of fire trucks and wealthy people in formal wear. Marcus materialized beside Olivia, his face tight with controlled panic. "We need to get you out of here before the press starts asking questions. The car is around the corner." But Olivia wasn't listening to Marcus anymore. She was watching Ethan walk away through the crowd, already dismissing the drama as he pulled out his phone to check on his daughter. She made a decision that terrified her in its spontaneity and lack of strategic planning. "Mr. Ward." He stopped, turning back with visible reluctance. "I want to offer you something different from before. Not a job, a partnership." His expression remained skeptical. What kind of partnership? Help me rebuild the foundation's programs from the ground up. Keep your security job, keep your schedule with your daughter. But consult with me on where the money should actually go, on what programs would create real impact versus just good publicity. She paused, then pushed forward. I'll pay you fairly for your time, but more importantly, I'll listen to what you say and actually implement it. Why would I trust you to follow through? You shouldn't, not yet, but give me a chance to prove I mean it. Ethan considered her for a long moment while sirens wailed and camera flashes illuminated the night. Then he shook his head slowly. I need to think about it. This isn't a decision I make on a street corner after watching you have some kind of crisis of conscience at a gala. Fair enough. Olivia pulled a business card from her clutch, the one with her direct cell number that she only gave to board members and family. Call me when you've decided, or don't call. Either way, I'm going to start making changes. She pressed the card into his hand and walked away before he could refuse it, before Marcus could pull her toward the waiting car, before the cameras could capture this moment and turn it into something it wasn't. The ride back to her penthouse passed in silence. Marcus attempted several times to debrief about the evening's events and how they should be spun for optimal coverage. Olivia ignored him, staring out the window at the city sliding past in streaks of light and shadow. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. I want full financial records for every foundation program, every dollar spent, every outcome measured. I want to see the gap between what we claim and what we actually achieve. Marcus's expression shifted to confusion. Why those numbers are just for the auditors and the board. The public-facing materials are what matter for maintaining donor confidence. I don't care about donor confidence anymore. I care about whether we're actually helping people or just performing help for an audience. Olivia. Marcus's tone took on the patient condescension he used when he thought she was being naive. This is how philanthropy works at scale. You can't micromanage every program, or you'll spend all your time in the weeds and lose sight of the bigger picture. What if the bigger picture is the problem? What if staying high-level and strategic is just an excuse to avoid confronting how little we're actually changing? The limousine pulled up to her building. The doorman rushed to open her door, greeting her with deferential warmth. Marcus followed her into the lobby, his tablet already glowing as he pulled up files. If you really want to see the detailed breakdowns, I can have them compiled by next week. Tonight, Olivia stopped in front of the elevator. I want them tonight. It's almost 11. The team has gone home. Then send them home with me. Email everything you can access now. I'll review the rest tomorrow. The elevator doors opened. Olivia stepped inside, then turned to face Marcus before they could close. And Marcus, stop trying to manage me. Stop filtering information based on what you think I should know. From now on, I want the truth. All of it, even the ugly parts. The doors closed on his stunned expression. Upstairs in her penthouse, Olivia changed out of the smoke-damaged gown and into sweats. She poured herself a glass of wine, then set it aside untouched. She needed clarity, not the pleasant fog alcohol provided. Her laptop glowed with incoming files from Marcus. Financial statements, program evaluations, grant distributions. The raw data behind the foundation's glossy annual reports. She read through the night, watching the city's lights gradually dim as sunrise approached. And with each page, her understanding of her own complicity deepened. The foundation donated computers to schools, but provided no funding for training teachers to use them effectively. They funded free health screenings, but not follow-up care for the problems the screenings identified. They built community centers in underserved neighborhoods, but staffed them with underpaid workers who couldn't afford to live in the communities they served. Every program looked impressive in press releases. Every initiative generated positive headlines. But the actual impact measured honestly was minimal. They were treating symptoms while ignoring causes, applying bandages to wounds that needed surgery. It was charity as performance art, generosity as branding exercise, help that helped the helper more than the helped. Olivia's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, then recognized the area code as local. This is Ethan Ward. I'll work with you, but on my terms. We do this quietly. No press releases about our partnership, no photo ops. We measure success by outcomes, not publicity. And if I think you're backsliding into performance charity, I'm out. Take it or leave it. She typed her response immediately. I'll take it. When can we start? His reply came seconds later. Thursday afternoon. Grace has a half day at school. I can meet you at 2 p.m. not at your office, somewhere in the community we're supposedly helping. Olivia sent him an address, a community center on the south side that the foundation had helped fund 3 years ago. She'd never visited it, had only seen photographs in the dedication ceremony press kit. Thursday arrived wrapped in gray October cold. Olivia drove herself, leaving Marcus and the foundation's usual entourage behind. The neighborhood changed gradually as she headed south, the gleaming towers of the Loop, giving way to lower buildings, then to blocks where empty storefronts outnumbered operating businesses. The community center occupied a converted warehouse, its brick exterior freshly painted, but the windows showing their age. Inside the space was clean, but worn the kind of tired that came from heavy use and inadequate maintenance budgets. Ethan waited near the entrance, dressed in jeans and a jacket. Beside him stood Grace, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her face curious and slightly wary. I hope you don't mind that I brought my daughter. Ethan's tone made it clear he didn't particularly care whether Olivia minded. She had a half day and I couldn't get a sitter on short notice. Of course not. Olivia crouched down to Grace's level. Hi, I'm Olivia. Grace studied her with the serious intensity of children who haven't yet learned to hide their assessments. You're the lady from the hospital. The one Daddy helped. That's right. Your dad saved my life. He saves lots of people. Grace stated this as simple fact without pride or boasting. It's what he does. The observation landed harder than any accusation could have. To Grace, her father's heroism was routine, unremarkable. Of course he saved lives. What else would he do when someone needed help? They toured the community center together. Ethan pointing out gaps between the foundation's funding and the center's actual needs. The computer lab featured aging machines that crashed frequently. The gym equipment was mismatched and in poor repair. The after-school program operated at half capacity because they couldn't afford enough staff. But the people who worked there radiated dedication despite the resource limitations. Olivia watched them interact with the kids who flooded the center after school, saw the care they took and the relationships they built. Saw impact happening in spite of inadequate funding rather than because of it. Ethan introduced her to Maria, who ran the youth programs while raising 3 kids on a salary that barely covered her own family's needs. To James, a former gang member turned mentor, whose past made him uniquely qualified to reach at-risk teenagers, but whose criminal record prevented him from getting better paying work. To Keisha, who volunteered 20 hours weekly while working 2 jobs because she believed the neighborhood kids deserved opportunities she'd never had. These were the people actually creating change. The foundation had provided seed money years ago, then moved on to other more photogenic initiatives. But Maria and James and Keisha stayed doing the grinding daily work that rarely made headlines but transformed individual lives one interaction at a time. By the end of the afternoon, Olivia's carefully constructed understanding of philanthropy had been thoroughly dismantled. She'd thought writing checks and building infrastructure was how change happened. But infrastructure without sustained support just became another abandoned promise. Grace fell asleep on a bench while the adults talked, her homework spread around her in a familiar arrangement that suggested this was normal for her. Ethan draped his jacket over her shoulders with automatic gentleness. So, he turned to Olivia. What did you learn today that I don't know anything? That the foundation has been funding performance instead of impact. That people like Maria and James and Keisha are doing more with nothing than we've accomplished with millions. Good. At least you're starting to see it. He paused. The question is what you're going to do about it. Olivia looked at Grace sleeping peacefully at the community center, full of kids who deserve better than society's scraps at Ethan, whose entire life was built around choosing presence over prestige. I'm going to change everything. The words came out with more certainty than she felt, starting with firing myself from running the foundation. Ethan's eyebrows rose. That seems extreme. Is it? I've been making decisions about communities I don't understand, funding programs I never follow up on, measuring success by press coverage instead of actual outcomes. Why should I keep doing a job I'm obviously bad at? Because Ethan's voice was gentler than she expected. Because you're one of the few people with access to real resources who's actually willing to admit they don't have all the answers. That's rare. Don't waste it by running away. Use it to do better. How? By hiring people like Maria to design and run programs. by funding what communities say they need instead of what looks good in annual reports, by showing up and staying engaged instead of cutting ribbons and disappearing. Will you help me not just consult, actually partner with me on rebuilding this thing the right way? Ethan looked at his sleeping daughter, then back at Olivia. On my terms. I'm not quitting my job. I'm not putting my face on your marketing materials. I'm not becoming your redemption story. Agreed. And if Grace needs me, she comes first, always. Of course, he extended his hand. Then let's see if a corporate COO and a night security guard can actually create something worth a damn. Olivia shook his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm and the strength in his grip. This partnership would be complicated and uncomfortable and would require her to confront every privileged assumption she'd built her life around. She couldn't wait to the first board meeting after Olivia announced her restructuring plan, felt like walking into an ambush. 14 faces around the mahogany table, each representing wealth and influence accumulated over generations. They'd built empires through calculated risk and ruthless efficiency. Charity to them was tax strategy dressed in humanitarian language. Richard Holbrook spoke first, his silver hair and custom suit projecting authority earned through 4 decades in private equity. Let me understand this correctly. You want to redirect 40% of our annual budget toward operational funding for existing programs rather than new initiatives. You want to hire community members with limited credentials to leadership positions, and you want to measure success through qualitative outcomes rather than quantifiable metrics. Olivia met his gaze steadily. That's correct, based on the recommendation of a security guard. Holbrook's tone made the occupation sound like an insult. Based on the recommendation of someone who actually understands the communities we claim to serve. Someone who's lived the reality our programs are supposed to address. Jennifer Park leaned forward, her expression calculating. She ran a venture capital firm that specialized in healthcare startups, had invested early in hard industries, and made a fortune when it went public. Olivia, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but this sounds like emotion overriding business sense. The foundation's current model works. We have excellent publicity, strong donor engagement, and a portfolio of programs that look impressive on paper. Looking impressive on paper isn't the same as creating actual change. Perhaps not. Park's smile didn't reach her eyes. But donors care about impressive. Board members care about impressive. Our model attracts capital that funds these programs in the first place. Change your approach too drastically, and you risk losing the funding that makes any intervention possible. So we should prioritize optics over impact. We should prioritize sustainability. Park's voice hardened. You're proposing we invest heavily in programs that won't generate positive headlines, that can't be easily measured, that won't attract major donors. That's not philanthropy. That's setting money on fire. Thomas Chen, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, spoke up from the far end of the table. He'd made his fortune in commercial real estate and approached charity with the same mentality he applied to property development. There's also the question of this partnership you've established. She tapped her tablet, pulling up information. Ethan Ward, $42,000 annual salary, no advanced degree, no nonprofit experience, no background that would justify the advisory role you've created. His background includes 16 years of military service, extensive trauma medicine experience, and a demonstrated commitment to his community that most people in this room couldn't match if they tried. The words came out sharper than Olivia intended. She saw several board members exchange glances, noting her defensiveness. Holbrook pressed forward, sensing vulnerability. We're not questioning Mr. Ward's character or his service to the country. We're questioning whether he possesses the expertise to guide a foundation with a $100 million endowment. These decisions require sophistication in grant-making, understanding of regulatory frameworks, strategic vision for scaling interventions. He has something more important than sophistication. Olivia kept her voice level, despite the anger building in her chest. He has authenticity. He knows what actually helps because he's lived in the communities experiencing the problems. He's raised a child on an income most of you spend on a single dinner. So we should hand over strategic control to someone because he's poor. Park's eyebrows rose. That's condescending, Olivia. Poverty doesn't automatically confer wisdom any more than wealth automatically confers callousness. The argument continued for 90 minutes, circling the same territory repeatedly. The board wanted measurable returns on charitable investment. Olivia wanted to fund interventions that might take years to show results. They wanted splashy new initiatives. She wanted to sustain existing programs doing quiet good work. They wanted control. She wanted to cede power to people closer to the problems. Finally, Holbrook called for a vote on her restructuring proposal. The result was predictable: 12 opposed, 2 in favor, 1 abstention. Olivia's vision for transforming the foundation had been thoroughly rejected. But as board chair, she still held executive authority over day-to-day operations. They could block the full restructuring. They couldn't stop her from using discretionary funds to pilot new approaches. She left the meeting and immediately called Ethan. They voted no. His voice came through calm and unsurprised. Of course they did. You're threatening their comfortable narrative about how change happens. So what do I do now? You do it anyway, just smaller. Build one thing that works, then use that success to prove them wrong. What kind of thing? A community health center on the South Side, full services for veterans and families, medical care, mental health support, job training, child care. Everything integrated, everything accessible. That would cost millions. So spend millions. You've got discretionary authority up to $5 million without board approval. Right? Use it. Olivia pulled up the foundation's financial dashboard on her phone. I have $6.2 million in discretionary funds for this fiscal year. Then let's build something worth $6 million. 3 months later, Olivia stood in an empty warehouse space on 47th Street, watching Ethan pace the concrete floor. Grace sat cross-legged in a corner, sketching the room's dimensions in a notebook covered with flower stickers. The building had been a manufacturing facility decades ago, then sat vacant for 15 years while the neighborhood around it slowly stabilized. The foundation had purchased it for a fraction of its assessed value, the city eager to see the empty space repurposed. Medical clinic here. Ethan gestured to the eastern wall where industrial windows let in afternoon light. 4 exam rooms, waiting area, pharmacy. Mental health offices upstairs where it's quieter. Job training center in the back section with computer labs and meeting spaces. Olivia made notes on her tablet, translating his vision into architectural requirements. Childcare west corner, ground floor. Easy access for drop-off, self-contained, but visible from the main entrance. Grace looked up from her drawing. Kids need to see their parents can reach them quickly. Makes them feel safer. Olivia blinked, surprised by the insight from an 8-year-old. You're absolutely right. How did you know that? Grace shrugged, returning to her sketch. Because I always feel better when I can see where Daddy is. The comment hung in the air, a reminder of all the nights Grace had spent in hospital cafeterias, staying within sight of her father's presence. Ethan's expression tightened briefly before he continued the walkthrough. Over the next 6 months, the warehouse transformed. Contractors worked in shifts, demolishing walls and building new ones. Electricians rewired the entire structure. Plumbers installed modern systems. The foundation's usual vendors, accustomed to premium finishes and luxury materials, adjusted to a budget that prioritized function over flash. Olivia visited the site weekly, then daily as opening approached. She learned to read construction drawings to understand load-bearing requirements in HVAC specifications and ADA compliance standards. She got dust in her hair and concrete residue on her designer shoes and calluses on her hands from helping move furniture. The work felt real in ways her usual foundation activities never had. She was building something tangible, creating spaces where actual services would be delivered to actual people. No abstract grant-making or arm's-length funding, just concrete and drywall and the slow assembly of a functional healing environment. Ethan recruited staff with the same philosophy he'd applied to designing the space. He hired Maria from the community center to run youth programs. James became the outreach coordinator, his past giving him credibility with the population they aimed to serve. Darius agreed to volunteer 2 afternoons weekly in the medical clinic. A social worker named Patricia, who'd grown up 3 blocks away, took charge of mental health services. They posted job openings in the neighborhood, first prioritizing local hiring over credentials. The mental health counselor had a master's degree from a state school rather than an Ivy League doctorate. The intake coordinator was a former client of similar programs who understood navigation barriers from personal experience. The security guard was a veteran with the PTSD who needed steady work and an employer willing to accommodate his triggers. The board noticed. Jennifer Parks sent increasingly pointed emails about hiring practices and the importance of professional credentials. Holbrook scheduled a site visit, his expressions skeptical as he toured the still unfinished facility. This seems very bare bones. His gaze swept across the waiting room with its durable furniture and linoleum floors. Our usual projects have a certain polish that reflects well on the Foundation's brand. This isn't about the Foundation's brand. Olivia kept her voice pleasant but firm. It's about creating a space that serves the community effectively. Still, a little more investment in aesthetics wouldn't hurt. Holbrook touched a wall painted in simple beige. First impressions matter. The first impression I want is that this place prioritizes people over appearances. After he left, Ethan found Olivia standing in the medical clinic staring at the exam rooms. He's right, about first impressions. I thought you didn't care about aesthetics. I don't care about luxury, but I do care about dignity. Ethan gestured around the space. This room is functional, but it feels institutional. People who come here have been dismissed and dehumanized by systems their entire lives. The space should tell them they matter. So what would you change? Color. Art on the walls created by community members. Plants, natural light. Small touches that make it feel less like a government office and more like a place designed with care. They spent the next 2 weeks implementing changes. Grace coordinated an art project at her school students, creating paintings that now hung in the waiting area. Maria organized a community mural painting day. Someone donated live plants that Patricia arranged throughout the space. The transformation was subtle but profound. The center went from institutional to welcoming without sacrificing function or adding significant cost. 2 weeks before the scheduled opening, Olivia received an emergency call from Patricia. One of their pre-enrolled clients, a veteran named Marcus Cole, had locked himself in his apartment with a gun and was refusing to respond to his family's attempts at contact. Where is he? Olivia was already grabbing her car keys. Patricia gave her an address in Inglewood. Ethan's on his way. Police are staging but not approaching yet. Olivia drove faster than was strictly legal, her mind racing through crisis protocols. They hadn't officially opened yet. They had no established procedures for this scenario. But they also couldn't ignore someone in their program facing a mental health emergency. She arrived to find 3 police cars parked at a careful distance from a brick 3 flat. Ethan stood on the sidewalk talking to a woman in her 60s whose face was streaked with tears. "He's my son," the woman's voice broke. "He came back from Afghanistan 7 years ago, and he hasn't been right since. Won't take his medication. Won't see his counselors. Just sits in that apartment, getting darker." Ethan spoke with practiced calm, asking about Marcus's triggers and medication history and the specific events that had precipitated this crisis. A police sergeant approached, his expression grave. "We can force entry, but given that he's armed, that increases risk significantly. If someone he knows and trusts could talk him down, we'd prefer that approach." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'll go," the sergeant hesitated. "You have training in crisis negotiation?" "I have experience with soldiers in crisis." "It'll have to be enough." Before anyone could object, Ethan walked toward the building. Olivia moved to follow, but Patricia caught her arm. "Let him work." They watched Ethan climb the exterior stairs to the second-floor landing. He knocked on the door, called Marcus's name. No response. He knocked again, speaking louder. "Marcus, it's Ethan Ward. I'm with the new center on 47th. Your intake counselor, Patricia, asked me to check on you." Silence stretched. Then a voice from inside, rough and angry. "Go away. I will. But first I need to know you're okay. Your mom's worried. Tell her I'm fine. If you're fine, why are you locked in there with a gun?" More silence, then the sound of movement inside the apartment. The door opened a crack, revealing a slice of Marcus's face. Mid-30s, gaunt eyes hollowed by exhaustion and pain. "How did you know about the gun?" "Your mom mentioned it. Can I come in?" The door opened wider. Ethan slipped inside the door, closing behind him. The police tensed hands, moving toward weapons. Olivia's heart hammered against her ribs. 15 minutes passed with no sound from the apartment. Then 20. Olivia paced the sidewalk, running through worst-case scenarios. The police sergeant spoke into his radio, updating command and requesting a tactical unit as backup. Finally, the apartment door opened. Ethan emerged first, followed by Marcus. The gun was nowhere visible. Marcus's hands were empty, his movements slow and uncertain. An ambulance pulled up, paramedics approaching with cautious professionalism. Marcus didn't resist as they guided him toward the vehicle. His mother rushed forward, embracing him while crying with relief. Ethan descended the stairs and found Olivia waiting at the bottom. Is he okay? He will be. Ethan's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. He needs immediate psychiatric evaluation and medication adjustment. But he's agreed to voluntary admission. How did you convince him? I told him the truth. That I've been where he is. That wanting to end the pain doesn't make you weak. That asking for help is the hardest and bravest thing a soldier can do. Olivia saw something in his expression, then a shadow that suggested personal knowledge of the darkness Marcus was experiencing. Ethan, have you ever? She couldn't finish the question, but he understood anyway. After Claire died, yeah. I thought about it. Grace was the only reason I didn't. He looked at Marcus being loaded into the ambulance. That's why I knew what to say, because someone said it to me once when I needed to hear it. The confession settled between them, adding new dimensions to Olivia's understanding of the man she'd partnered with. He wasn't just someone who helped others out of abstract principle. He helped because he knew intimately what it meant to need help and barely survived long enough to accept it. The center opened on a cold November morning. No ribbon-cutting ceremony. No politicians or major donors. Just a small gathering of community members, staff, and the families who would benefit from the services being offered. Olivia had wanted to keep it low-key, but word spread anyway. Local news sent a crew. A few board members showed up, their presence feeling more like surveillance than support. Holbrook stood near the back, his expression neutral, but his body language broadcasting skepticism. Ethan spoke first, standing in the waiting room surrounded by the community art that now covered the walls. This center exists because people like Maria and Patricia and James showed up every day to do work that nobody noticed or appreciated. It exists because veterans like Marcus deserve support that treats them as human beings rather than problems to be managed. It exists because one CEO was willing to admit she didn't have all the answers and listen to people who actually understood the communities she wanted to serve. He gestured toward Olivia. So thank you for being willing to learn, for putting resources behind your words, for showing up when most people in your position would have just written a check and moved on. Olivia's throat tightened. She stepped forward, suddenly nervous despite having delivered hundreds of speeches to much larger audiences. A year ago, I nearly died in a car accident. Someone I'd never met saved my life. Then he taught me something harder. Her eyes found Ethan in the small crowd. He taught me that healing isn't just for the wounded. It's for anyone who still cares enough to treat by, anyone brave enough to admit they need help, and wise enough to accept it when it's offered. Grace stepped forward, then holding a drawing she'd made. The image showed the center building surrounded by people holding hands. Above them, a sun shone in bright yellow, its rays reaching toward every figure in the drawing. This is for everyone who comes here. Grace's voice was small but clear. So they know they're not alone. She handed the framed drawing to her father, who hung it in the entrance where everyone entering the center would see it. The crowd applauded, the sound warm and genuine. After the brief ceremony ended, Olivia found herself standing with Ethan and Grace near the medical clinic entrance. Staff were already beginning intake for their first clients, the careful choreography of helping beginning in earnest. So, Ethan looked around the space they'd built together. Think it'll work? I think we've given it the best possible chance. Olivia paused. But this is just the beginning, isn't it? Yeah. The real work starts now. The daily grind of showing up and serving and adjusting based on what we learn. Grace tugged on her father's sleeve. Dad, you promised. Ice cream if I didn't complain during the boring speeches. Ethan laughed, the sound lighter than Olivia had ever heard from him. I did promise that. He looked at Olivia. Want to join us? There's a place 2 blocks away that makes homemade flavors. The invitation surprised her. In all their months of working together, they'd maintained professional boundaries. Meetings and site visits and strategic planning sessions, but nothing social. Nothing that suggested their partnership extended beyond the center they'd built. I'd like that. They walked through the neighborhood together, Grace between them, chattering about the art project her class had created for the center's waiting room. The November air bit at their exposed skin, but the sun was bright, casting sharp shadows on sidewalks, still decorated with fall leaves. The ice cream shop was small and worn, its counter staffed by a teenager who greeted Ethan by name. Grace ordered mint chocolate chip. Ethan chose coffee. Olivia, overwhelmed by options, asked Grace for a recommendation and ended up with salted caramel. They sat in a booth by the window eating ice cream and watching the neighborhood move through its afternoon rhythms. Olivia felt the weight of board opposition and funding challenges and all the obstacles they'd faced trying to sustain what they'd built. But in this moment, eating $5 ice cream with a security guard and his 8-year-old daughter, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Purpose without performance. Connection without calculation. The simple satisfaction of having done something worthwhile without needing anyone's approval to validate it. Grace finished her ice cream and pulled out her homework, spreading it across the table with the unself-consciousness of a child accustomed to working wherever her father happened to be. Olivia and Ethan sat in comfortable silence while Grace worked through math problems. Outside, the city continued its endless motion. Inside, in this small booth, in this neighborhood ice cream shop, three people who had saved each other in different ways simply existed together. No crisis to resolve, no board to convince, no press to manage, just the quiet aftermath of having built something worth building and the knowledge that tomorrow they'd have to show up and prove it could sustain itself. But tomorrow was tomorrow. Today they had ice cream and sunshine and the beginning of something neither quite knew how to name, but both recognized as valuable. 5 years passed like water flowing around stones, reshaping everything while leaving essential elements intact. The Ward Center grew from uncertain experiment to established institution. The medical clinic served 300 patients monthly. Mental health services expanded to include group therapy and family counseling. Job training programs placed 80% of graduates into stable employment. The board's skepticism gradually eroded as measurable outcomes accumulated. Holbrook still questioned decisions, but his opposition had softened to something resembling grudging respect. Park invested personal funds in expanding services. Other foundation board members began visiting, seeing for themselves the gap between charity as performance and charity as transformation. Ethan remained night security at St. Haven, insisting on keeping the job, despite Olivia's repeated offers of full-time positions with better pay. The center work fit around his scheduled consultations happening during Grace's school hours or on weekends when she could accompany him. Grace herself transformed from the 8-year-old who'd colored pictures in hospital cafeterias to a 13-year-old who volunteered 20 hours weekly at the center. She'd inherited her father's calm competence, his instinct for showing up when needed. On a Saturday afternoon in October, Olivia found Grace in the center's medical clinic, showing a new patient how to use the blood pressure monitor. The girl's hands moved with practiced confidence, explaining each step clearly and checking the reading with the precision of someone who'd watched medical professionals work countless times. The patient, an elderly woman with diabetes, smiled at Grace with obvious affection. "You're going to make a wonderful doctor someday." Grace's face lit up with the comment, then turned slightly shy. "I'm going to try. My dad says wanting to help isn't enough. You have to show up and do the work even when it's hard." Sounds like good advice. After the patient left, Olivia approached Grace. "Your dad's right about showing up being the important part." Grace looked up from cleaning the equipment. "He usually is. About the important stuff anyway." The comment carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. Grace had grown up watching her father choose presence over prestige, had learned through example that value came from what you did rather than what you claimed. "Can I ask you something?" Olivia settled into the chair beside the exam table. "What made you want to become a doctor?" Grace considered the question carefully, her expression thoughtful. "Because I've seen what happens when people don't get help. When my mom died, there were so many things the doctors couldn't fix. But Dad never stopped trying to help people, even after losing her. He taught me that you don't quit just because something's hard or hopeless. You show up anyway." The girl's voice carried conviction that most adults never achieved. "And I've seen people come to this center who were broken in all kinds of ways. Physical, mental, emotional. And sometimes they get better. Sometimes they don't. But they always deserve someone who cares enough to try." Olivia felt tears prick her eyes. This child, raised in hospital cafeterias and community centers, understood healing in ways Olivia's expensive education had never taught her. "Your dad should be very proud of you." Grace smiled, quick and genuine. "He is. He tells me all the time." She paused. "You should be proud too. Of this place. It actually helps people." The compliment delivered with a 13-year-old's directness meant more than any board commendation or press coverage. Later that evening, as the center prepared to close, Olivia found Ethan in his usual spot near the entrance, reviewing incident reports and checking that all areas were secure. His hair showed more gray now, his face carrying lines that hadn't been there 5 years ago. But his eyes held the same steady determination she remembered from the night he'd saved her life. Grace wants to be a doctor. Olivia settled into the chair across from him. I know. Been talking about it for 2 years now. She'll be excellent at it if she works hard and gets lucky with scholarships. Ethan's pragmatism hadn't diminished. Medical school's expensive. The foundation has scholarship programs, I'm aware. He looked up from his reports. But she'll earn it herself. No special treatment because her father happens to work with you. I wasn't suggesting special treatment, just that there are resources available for students who demonstrate both need and merit. Ethan nodded, accepting the distinction. They sat in comfortable silence while the center emptied around them. Staff called goodbyes. The last few clients departed into the October evening. The building settled into the quiet that came after a full day of service. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been there that night? Olivia asked the question she'd wondered about countless times. When the ambulance brought me in, sometimes. Ethan set down his reports, but not as much as I used to. Why not? Because I realized the what-ifs don't matter. What happened, happened. We made something good from it. That's enough. The answer was quintessentially him. Practical, focused on outcomes rather than counterfactuals. No drama or dwelling, just acceptance and forward motion. Thank you. Olivia met his eyes. For everything. For saving my life. For teaching me what actually matters. For partnering with me on this. You already thanked me multiple times. I know, but I wanted to say it again, without any agenda or performance. Just gratitude. Ethan's expression softened slightly. You did the hard part. Most people in your position would have felt guilty for a week, written a check and moved on. You actually changed. That's rare. Outside the city moved through its Saturday evening rhythms. The center they'd built together stood solid and functional, a testament to what happened when resources met genuine commitment. It wasn't perfect. Funding remained challenging. Staff turnover created gaps. Some clients succeeded while others struggled or disappeared. But it was real. It helped people. And every day it opened its doors represented a choice to prioritize healing over headlines, impact over optics, presence over prestige. Grace appeared in the doorway, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Ready, Dad? Ethan stood gathering his reports and keys. Yeah, kiddo. Let's go home. As they walked toward the exit, Grace turned back to Olivia. Are you coming to the volunteer appreciation dinner next week? I wouldn't miss it. Good. I'm making a speech about why I volunteer here. I want you to hear it. The invitation was casual but meaningful. This young woman who'd grown up in the center's shadow acknowledging Olivia as part of the community rather than just a donor or board member. After they left, Olivia remained in the center alone. She walked through the spaces they'd created, touching walls and examining art, and thinking about the distance she'd traveled from that rainy night when a stranger in a security uniform had refused to let her quit. She'd been someone else then, someone who measured worth in stock prices and headline mentions and boardroom victories, someone who mistook performance for purpose and optics for impact. She wasn't sure exactly who she'd become instead. The transformation was ongoing, incomplete. She still made mistakes, still struggled with the impulse to control rather than collaborate. But she showed up, she listened, she put resources behind her convictions and measured success by changed lives rather than positive publicity. It was harder than writing checks, more complicated than cutting ribbons, required sustained attention and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege and power, and the distance between intention and impact. But it was also the most meaningful work she'd ever done. And as she locked the center's doors and headed toward her car, Olivia felt something she'd spent her entire life chasing without quite achieving. Peace with herself. Pride earned through action rather than acclaim. The quiet satisfaction of having built something that would outlast her involvement and continue serving long after she moved on to whatever came next. The work wasn't finished, would never be finished. But it was real and it mattered and it existed because people had chosen to show up for each other when it would have been easier to walk away. That was enough. That would always be enough.